Today I am here with Dr. Mike Rowe, professor at the University of Liverpool in the School of Management. We're here to talk about different leadership styles for different times, the intersection of policing and urban design, and individual discretion in policing versus the environment in which it is exercised. We begin by talking about how higher education seems to be going through a universal period of transition with little certainty about the future, and how these times call for a different kind of leadership. Mike points out research on how systemic inequalities in policing seem to persist despite decades of training and diversification efforts, and how this has led him to consider what might be happening in the system environment to thwart best intentions. For example, an important point that I think he makes is that while individual officers face accountability for decisions, the organizational factors shaping those decisions are rarely examined. Mike also looks at the role of discretion in policing in the context of technology and the use of metrics in shaping those decisions. Asked by me, what are the qualities of a good officer, he says, good officers never make situations worse by their presence. We finally turn our attention to urban design, and we touch on how it intersects with policing. We also talk about the long-time practice of relocating entire communities in redevelopment projects, and how this breakdown of the social fabric impacts the community's sense of safety. Finally, we end on a hopeful note as Mike shares his experiences with urban regeneration and some of the innovative approaches that he learned from those experiences. My name is Nancy Hess, and we are so glad that you are here with us on our new Muni Square podcast, and we hope that you will look us up on Substack at munisquare.substack.com. Thanks, and let's get started. I was just going over the idea that we're on our previous conversation. I feel like I want to start out by saying, where have you been since then? How have you been in general? Tell me, how's your life and how are things?
Everything's kind of thrown in turmoil by your president.
Hey, you think you got it bad?
No. I'm just aware of some colleagues who've effectively lost their jobs as a consequence of the funding cuts because their research is on disability, for example, and that's no longer something of interest. In the UK, we've got a crisis in higher education with strike action in a number of universities, redundancies being threatened, etc. Liverpool at the moment's okay, but it's led to greater anxiety amongst academics and staff. And so one of the things I also do is take on union casework. So I look after, if individuals have got problems, they need union support. I do quite a bit of that. So I spent most of the morning talking to union members about their problems. So it was busy.
So what is the role that you take on as that person? Is it a role of the union membership that you assume?
No, a union member, a normal member would not do this work. You volunteer to take on additional responsibilities. As a university, we have a branch of the union. So people step forward to be the president, the treasurer, etc., various roles on the committee. And then there are additional people who volunteer to do work supporting individual members who have problems, whether it be issues with their manager or a disability that requires reasonable adjustment to their work routines or physical environment. It's representing members who need support. And that's entirely voluntary, increasing the workload.
We have a strange confluence here of factors, one being shifting demographics that the colleges and universities have been planning for. And then in addition, this distress, overfunding, and how it's the arbitrary nature, not knowing exactly who's going to get hit, how it's going to impact.
Yeah. I mean, this crisis here is slightly different to the US, but it's also slightly different on the continent, but it seems to be a universal thing. Higher education is going through a transitional period with very little certainty about the future. The other thing, and this is kind of connected, I was just having a conversation. Well, the conversation is come up in a number of different contexts. But it was looking at Gary's post the other day on
the safe to fail.
And just a follow-up commentary, and maybe I haven't formulated this clearly in my own mind, but it's something I've talked about in teaching context before, which is when organizations expand during times of relative financial comfort, they expand in particular ways and they promote managers of a particular caliber. When things get difficult and budgets are shrinking, those managers are not necessarily the ones you want in place. But it's also the same for, think when organizations have expanded in one way, they contract in a different way. So they might invest in new facilities and new IT equipment, capital assets or buildings or vehicles. When they shrink, they get rid of staff because that's where the bulk of the spending is. In reality, the non-capital budgets where the majority of the spend is, and that's where they look. So you've got all these assets when you expand, but you get rid of staff when you contract. It's like a rock. When it's warm, it expands. When it freezes, it contracts. That process of expanding and contracting creates weaknesses and vulnerabilities that I don't
That's
think
right.
we think about. Mm.
It
Yeah.
really is this, you have to be able to measure the risk and say, I don't know. We don't know. This is where we are right now. Nobody knows what exactly is going to work. But
Mm.
we have to reach a point where we can say, I'm willing to take this risk because, and here's what I believe this
Yeah.
will accomplish. And so we're in a different place. And I agree with
Mm.
you. There's a lot of people in leadership that were just fine for the job that they were put in there to do, but
Mm.
we're in a different. And this is a good lead in to some of your work around bureaucracies,
Mm.
public service decision making, and policing in particular.
Mm.
When you talk about the institutional character and systemic inequalities, that first key idea we discussed, I wrote down some notes that come to my mind. When I talk to police officers, the practice of promoting based on seniority being one of the ways in which you kind of perpetuate some
Yeah.
institutional behaviors that are not necessarily geared towards future
Yeah.
development. I also think about the lack of emphasis on development, that
Mhm.
there's some attention at the top, maybe sending them to chiefs of police schools or something, but there is oftentimes not any kind of deeper emphasis. I think you and Ron Camacho talked about this. There's not as much.
Uh-huh.
And I also think about the political behaviors, which can go unchecked. And if the political behaviors go unchecked, then I don't know if you were to speak to officers and say, why did you do this? They might say, well, I was afraid not to do it, that I would get in trouble if I did not follow. This is the practice that we do. When this person gets in trouble, we do XYZ, which is different from what we normally do.
When you say political, what do you mean by political? I think I understand. I just want.
Right. So I think of political as there could be a call from a politician that says, we're going to pay particular attention to this group, this part of town, and we
Yep.
want you to take greater attention, which could sound benign, or it could be something, or we're not going to take a look at this other thing, which
Yep.
you
Okay.
have
Yeah.
maybe been investigating, but we're just telling you there's nothing.
In the UK, there's not quite that level of political interference officially. There is not the directly elected element to many police organisations. We have some political oversight, but it's very loose and not about day-to-day or operational decisions. It's much more strategic. That's not to say police organisations don't have their own kinds of politics where decisions are made to police some things and not other things. Definitely, that's still there, even if it's not formally political in a kind of capital P, if you like, political. So we have, I mean, I can think of just one example. I remember observing officers who were about to police a gay pride event in a city centre. They were explicitly told, we're not policing this as a potential source of criminality. We're protecting this event from any threat to it. Do not pay attention to what you suspect might be drug use amongst those attending gay pride. That is not our concern today. So there's that kind of approach. That was very clear that officers would be crossing a line if they policed in a normal way at that event. That might be controversial in some contexts. It made sense in that context.
When you think about the types of systemic inequality, what is it that drives your thoughts about this?
I guess it comes from having observed individual actions, each of which could be explained and justified on the basis of experience, information, what have you, and therefore not subject to a kind of challenge. Nevertheless, being part of a picture of disproportionate or unequal treatment. What could not be explained was why something else didn't happen. You can explain actions, but not inaction or inattention. So it's not individual acts or decisions by public servants. It's the fact that they were there to make or not make that decision rather than somewhere else. It's kind of taking the focus away from individual cognition, motivations, prejudices, biases, and asking questions about what else is driving these patterns, because they persist, regardless of how much effort is put into training, regardless of how diverse a workforce you recruit. And I think in policing context, we have evidence for since 1984, there's been an appropriate date as it happens. Since 1984, gathering data on police use of particular powers to stop and search citizens. Since 1984, demonstrated persistent, disproportionate use of powers against particularly young black men, but young men in particular, more generally as well. So despite the attention, despite efforts to make changes, this based on an assumption that it's about individual officers, it persists 40 years on.
Yeah.
Same inequality.
I would like to understand how you approach your work, how you find your voice, your approach and method and perspective for looking at systems and inequality and some of the ways that we function or don't function well.
Partly it comes from my past experience. I was, if you like, and I'll use Lipsky's phrase, a street-level bureaucrat. I was in social security in the UK when they were going from paper-based systems through the early stages of computerization. That experience informed a lot of my thinking because it was clear that staff were struggling to make sensible decisions using the new computer systems. They were having to work around the computer system to get the right outcomes. So they were using lots of discretion all the time, and it made very clear how much their judgments had mattered before the computers came in and how much judgment there remained after the computers arrived. So it's that kind of observation that I think is important. So when I then started observing police officers, it was over a period of 6 years in 3 different police organizations. What was interesting was, yes, I'm observing individual officers, but I'm seeing those officers dealing with similar kinds of incidents, cases, etc., in different organizational settings over 6 years. Through that, you understand what leads to different outcomes, what different decisions in those settings. One organization has a computer system that forces officers to record particular decisions in particular ways. And that makes them think about how they're going to have to justify their actions in the future. Another organization, if you arrest somebody, that's the end of your involvement in the case. So it's simpler to arrest somebody than to deal sensibly and in detail with the case because you're passing it on to somebody else. Yeah. So just the structure and processes become clearer because you observe it over time and in different organizations. Another example, the introduction of body-worn cameras in one organization and how that affected officer conduct as they began to get used to it and actually began to use the cameras in different ways. So it's over time and in different organizations. I think that key thing is a moment of change observed in 3 places reveals what is distinct about the 3 places, but also what was distinct about what was there before and what the change did.
Yeah.
And that gets away from the individual. The individual's there still, but that individual is making sense of all of this.
And you're thinking in terms of discretion when I look at the notes. So
Yeah.
you might think that this is an officer's discretion, but based on your observation and study, you're not sure what's shaping.
It's very rare that what the officer does is a surprise to me after those 6 years of observation. More often than not, I'd have a good idea what was going to happen and what decision they were likely to make. So They are exercising discretion, but that discretion is not a free choice. Discretion is driven and shaped by those factors, the computer systems, the supervision. Law is in there, but it's very often a very minor factor. Also, how does a member of the public respond?
Yeah.
Yeah. Some research can look at discretion as if it's the choice of an individual, but it's not. It's an interaction of lots of things, including the person on the other end.
If it goes to court, it typically is on that individual.
Yes, absolutely.
By conforming to what you're expected to do, you're more likely to get support should you go to court because you followed the protocol that was established.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But it also means that if there's a misconduct case, it's also treated as if it's an individual. So if there's a complaint against an officer for their use of a particular power, like if you stop and search somebody in the UK context, so kind of stop and frisk in the US, or if you arrest somebody and use handcuffs, that can be deemed inappropriate or excessive use of force and might be the subject of a complaint. The officer's behavior is shaped by things other than their individual choices, but it's treated in a misconduct case or a complaint as an individual officer's own decision and solely their decision. And that's unjust.
Yeah. I would like to revisit an earlier discussion with you that would help to reestablish just how it was that you came to be embedded in a way close enough to these decision-making scenarios. Can you tell us a little bit about those relationships that enabled you to have conversations and observe closely?
So we were approached by a police organization looking at statistics showing that there is this persistent, over 40 years, disproportionate use of police powers against young black men. They'd tried everything they could think of and wanted to have another look at it, wanted another set of eyes on it. So they approached me and I proposed to do this study to observe officers, because for me, drawing upon my own personal experience, the question wasn't just why does an officer do X? It's also a question of why that officer not do any of the other things. If we focus also on just that one decision to do X, we're taking it context, the role that they perform. So actually, most officers don't use this power, this authority to stop and search people, for example. Most of them use it very rarely. So the question is, why do they use it when they do use it? Rather than, can each individual decision be justified? We need to see how it fits into their understanding of their role and of what they're doing most of the rest of the time.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to be with officers doing their job as they understood it.
Would you go back to an earlier time in your life and share something about your first contact with police? Would you describe yourself as open or perhaps cynical, or were there some origin stories that formed your curiosity?
To be honest, I had no interest in the police before. And my encounters with the police had been as a student on demonstrations. Back in the 1980s, I'd had some encounters with the police at the margins of that, but nothing that particularly jaundiced me against them. I hadn't engaged in any policing research before I was approached to do this. I'd done work on discretion and decision-making and street-level bureaucracy, but not with police officers. I came with an open mind. I tried not to assume things that I understood from fairly common political debates about police authority, racism, etc. I tried to put that all aside as far as I was able. Look at those officers as fairly as I could. When I was observing officers, they would always have to have given their permission, obviously, and their supervisors always had to be comfortable with it as well. So I was not observing officers who were deemed to be risky or maverick. These were good officers who understood themselves to be good officers and whose supervisors saw them as good officers. And that's what's key. What makes good officers still contribute to the problems that we find. The bad officers we know, bad officers, we want them out. I don't want to be observing them misusing their power and authority. because that puts me at risk. Good officers still contribute to this problem.
And what are some of the qualities of good officers that stand out to you that you would like to see emulated?
I think there's quite a mix in there. I think there's some work from the 1970s by William K. Muir on police as he calls them street corner politicians. And he talks about them being comfortable with making judgments about people while also being confident about using force on occasion because you will need to. I think that's part of the answer. But for me, the good officers I observed never made a situation worse by their presence. They didn't attend an incident and by their arrival aggravated. There were other officers I did observe who did manage to aggravate virtually every scene they attended. Others who just, you're always going to affect what happens as you arrive when you're a police officer, but so far as you're able to, you don't make things worse by your appearance. An unwillingness to rush to judgment is important as well. Of being able to put aside assumptions and preconceptions very quickly and to actually be open to be proven wrong or to be surprised.
I would like to ask you about the trust building component. And we talked about rather than taking the criminalization mindset, there has been growth in embedding social workers in the departments and with good effect, and the sense that the officer who may not be good at the empathy piece can connect an at-risk person with a social worker trust, perhaps. I don't know how this looks in the UK, if see any hope in this method.
I think there's been experiments over the years, particularly on issues of mental health, for police officers to work alongside community psychiatric nurses or other mental health practitioners. It's had patchy results from what I've seen. I'm no expert on the field, but I have noticed there's more risk aversion in mental health work in the UK context than there is in the police. I don't know about whether it crosses to the US as well. Actually, the social worker is much less welcome very often than the police because the social worker brings other powers to bear, which can be even more intrusive than the police at times. I remember this is from before my work with the police, but somebody expressed concern about the health and well-being of some children, a family of a single mother with 3 children. There was some concern about whether they were well looked after. Somebody raised the question, well, why haven't you raised your concerns with social services? And it said, because as soon as social services get involved, you're on a path you have no control over.
Yes.
And more importantly, if they get taken into care, they're in trouble. You know they're not being looked after. Social services getting involved causes all sorts of other problems. I don't see them as a trustworthy companion alongside a police officer. That's perhaps a bit judgmental of social workers.
Let me go a little different direction. This is going to be a left field question for you. And if it doesn't work out, doesn't have to stay in our discussion here. But more recently, I've had these interesting, both in reading, and now I have 2 people lined up to do some Square conversations with me that are in urban design. I was reading about the work done in Rio de Janeiro. And this is true in New York City. The old method was to relocate an entire neighborhood into a new place where there's new housing. And the newer urban design thinking is that, no, you go in, you improve the infrastructure, you give them clean water, better sewage, and you try to retain the social networks. That focus on neighborhoods might be key. We're working around policing and social services when maybe the key is creating a neighborhood structure that enables self-organization. Does that resonate with you?
Yes, I could go on for some time, so you to rein me in.
Good.
I live in Liverpool. The Victorian success story. It was a commercial hub in terms of the docks were the second port of empire. Obviously, there was association with slavery, etc. So that is a particular history there. Great prosperity on the back of that. And then goes into decline. Probably in the early 20th century, it goes into real decline. And the docks now have shrunken to a very small size in comparison to what it used to be. With that, much of its economic rationale. During the Second World War, much of the city was bombed. Lots of substandard housing, dereliction, and some of the old Victorian slums were in no condition to be lived in. So this was an opportunity for planners to kind of clear out whole neighborhoods and move them to new towns. So we had those great experiments in urban planning or town planning. And there's one in particular that was really interesting, is a place called Kirby. And it was designed to take in what were deemed as kind of hard-working working class, not those who were indolent or what have you. It was designed around industry to be a local community with poor connections to Liverpool. And this is the point, that you create this artificial place and recreate a community, you move it or create another one around the car. It's the first place in the UK policed almost exclusively by a mobile patrol and radio-controlled patrol. So it was a great experiment in a different mode of policing. There's a TV drama about it called Z Cars. It's black and white from the 1960s, and it's quite terrible, but takes you back to this different way of thinking about doing things. Very rational, planned, blah, blah, blah. And it just doesn't work. Kirby is a problem now in terms of the quality of the housing, the design of the community, and the jobs weren't sustained particularly there. So, and it's now detached and still partly detached from Liverpool.
Is it a viable community? Are people still moving in there?
People still live there. I'm no expert on Kirby, but I think a focus on keeping communities together would be a very different approach.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, in Muni Square, we have this opportunity, I think, as we grow to work across these silos. I don't recall ever having these conversations with policing before, but why would they not be an integral part of a conversation within urban design? Francia, very much interested in the sort of environmental design aspect.
Yeah.
And so I've never thought of it before until my more recent inquiry into what happened to the city of Baltimore. I found the writer who also wrote about Rio, which Eduardo is there. So now we're going to talk about both Rio and Baltimore. And there may be some people in the UK that could also address this. Like if people that have been involved in housing, they must have thought about how public safety fits into the design. And what does that look like?
One of the interesting connections you talk about Baltimore and Rio is a US historian he's actually of kind of Kenya before and post colonialization, before the end of empire and into independence. He's looked at Nairobi, and what he's drawing is a parallel between the planning and development of Nairobi and Liverpool. It's the same mentality. Part of your rationale for being able to take communities and move them in this way is that you think of them as an indigenous population that is inferior to those who are endowed with the ability to make these grand plans. And you see the same sorts of plans in the two examples. Now, I don't want to overdraw the parallel, but it is quite interesting. When police get involved in planning and design, what they want is to be able to get in and out of places, or to be able to see everything, or to have no back alleys or passages that they can't drive down, and that kind of thing. That's their mentality towards design. I think neighborhoods should be designed around the community, as in the social side of it. It needs to come through much more than just thinking about the physical infrastructure and utilities. What makes this space something that people use in ways that are sociable? Another example of a planning disaster town built around the car. And again, I'm not very familiar with this. This is a story told by others. Because not everybody had a car, it meant that people walked across the roads, because that's how you get from A to B. And there's no facility for pedestrians particularly. And so there's a particular association with walking across roads, that you don't treat roads as just for vehicles. You actually treat it as part of your territory, because that's the only way to survive. It's an interesting thing to think about, that if you don't design it about the people who are actually going to use the space, then they'll subvert it. Paths of desire, the reason you see people don't use the footpaths as laid out is because they will pick the path that works for them. Yeah, I mean, we effectively create problems that only seem to increase with time.
Yeah.
So yeah, planning is interesting because it
It
brings
really
together all of the different services in ways that other disciplines don't.
it's interesting to bring together people from
Mm.
different fields and perspectives. I really want to, in 2025, begin bringing in some elected officials. I think it's time. I really think we need their voices because they have the ability to influence in ways that our great ideas don't always get broadcast. And
Mm.
so I do hope to get some
Yeah,
people.
I mean, it's a problematic relationship where, certainly in the UK context, where you have local government is run by elected
Mm.
politicians, but other local services increasingly are out of their control. So housing is largely out of their control. They can approve or reject planning requests. They don't own the properties. They don't build social housing in the way they used to. They don't have control over health or transport in the way they might want to. Planning then brings in other agencies with different agendas without the kind of elected representatives involved. So there's struggle over legitimacy emerges from that. So I'm an elected politician. I have more legitimacy than you as a public servant. So you have not just disciplinary differences in terms of how you see the world or how you see your organization's interests. You have these legitimacy differences as well.
Right. And I know you have talked about this before, Mike, but let's talk about housing, for instance, and
Mm.
planning. Is it regional?
Planning is done by local government. Liverpool City Council has a planning department, and it can approve or reject planning applications, but it doesn't build in the way that a local government would have built social housing. So it's now relied upon housing associations, which are kind of autonomous public bodies, and they kind of have to make plans on the basis of financial rationales in the same way as other organizations might have to. They don't have to make a huge surplus, but they have to cover their costs and loans. What used to be deliberate public investment in social housing is now, a more complicated affair. So there's much less social housing has been built over the last 40 years than previously. That causes all sorts of problems in cities where there just isn't the housing stock in terms of social housing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder how we might close this today. I think this last question I'm interested in the ideas, people, or events that have really shaped your thinking, either recently or over time, that you might share.
So just going back to your talk about focus on the neighborhood. So I was 20 years ago involved in a urban regeneration program in Nottingham. And so this program was European funded. It was quite small in comparison to other programs. It took a particularly novel approach. Instead of thinking that the money it had, it should spend in order to do good things, this organization tried to use its money to change the way the big spending bodies did what they did. So rather than think, okay, I've got some money, I can build a community center or run a project which will last 3 years and then finish, they tried to use the money to persuade or to influence the health services or housing, etc., were run in that community. So give that community a voice in shaping those services, using this regeneration money as a way of leveraging change. A very simple example was a tram line being built through the community. This decision was taken. They had no say in it. It was decided. It was coming through. Rather than just say the community rejects this and is opposed to this tram line, some saw the benefits of it. The key thing was to say, okay, this tram is going to be built. So what influence can we have? And the influence you can have is to say how it is built. What arrangements are put in place to manage that experience of disruption as the building goes ahead? So that was a voice you could give that community to say, okay, you're going to build it through the middle of a shopping street. How do we keep those businesses open during that period? How do we manage the noise as you're building through a residential community, for example? It got away from the sense of this is being done to us and we have no power. to, okay, this is happening, but we can influence what happens here so that it fits with this community's other needs and interests. It's just a kind of a different approach and a different mentality that saw things much more about trying to influence rather than to do things independently of others or to object or protest. That was a very interesting project. I got involved on a voluntary basis as a director. My role as a director was not to make decisions, to ensure that anything I said was informed by a constituency. I took things away to people to talk about. How do we influence this? What do you need from this? So my voice was not a powerful voice. It was only the voice of other people. And it was very clear rules around how that worked, which was quite interesting as well.
Did you help create those rules, Mike, or was there something there?
I learned about it during a process of doing some research and got involved because I found it really interesting as a different approach to doing things.
I like that very much. I don't know what would be a good word. Self-organized is that the one that we've already mentioned today, collaborative, but the direct role is very important. It's just different from what we associate.
It was talked of in terms of being a partnership, but partnership is much easily used and much misunderstood as a term. So that doesn't adequately capture what was going on. It was a deliberate attempt to do differently, to think differently about how decisions are legitimately made about communities that have been powerless for many years. In terms of my teaching, I'm in a management school. There's a very traditional way of thinking about teaching management to undergraduates and postgraduates. I try to, I've been over the last 3 or 4 years, been taking a different approach, which is to throw most of the conventional ways of thinking up against the wall and see if they really are worth our attention. And by bringing in questions about the assumptions we make about who we are, where those assumptions come from, what we think of as natural, normal, inevitable. One of the interesting things to do is to bring in a multi-species perspective. And you've touched upon it a few times with the deer or whatever you're trying to cross the roads, etc. And that's, we like to think, and this goes back to the kind of thing about the decision making for police officers. We think in our heads, but we're not just in our heads. We are not also autonomous human beings. We survive because we have living things in us, and aside from the other people we depend upon, the other animals and the environment in which we depend. How do we bring all of that into thinking? There's some interesting stuff being done on multi-species perspectives on organizations, bigger social issues. That might also be a way of thinking about things differently.
Thank you very much, Mike, for taking the time. I've really enjoyed catching up and thank you.
Take care.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.
What you do